Before we actually get into our lesson, I've been asked concerning some of the events that have transpired over at camp over the last few days. So let me fill you in a little bit on what occurred and all. Roger called me on Friday morning and said that the previous afternoon, while he was gone taking a injured camper to the hospital, that they had spied a vehicle in our swimming hole, which of course is water about that high. That you can get into the swimming hole from the main road that goes by there, but it's driving down in there. But evidently, this was a stolen vehicle, and the criminal that was driving the stolen vehicle escaped into the woods while his companion was arrested on the spot by the law. And come find out they got 3 law officers in the totality of Polk County. So there's a good place not to move if you want to, unless you don't mind fighting criminals by yourself. And of course they ended up getting the bloodhounds out, and who knows how many hours that took. He evaded arrest. But then when the kids went down to the cabin, they realized that somebody had knocked out the back door and had taken a phone or 2. And evidently he was in the cabin a couple of times. He got an AT&T phone that don't work out there, and so he had to come back and get another one. Of course that scared everybody to death and everything. But they still have not apprehended this criminal. He is in Polk County, one of the 10 most wanted criminals in Polk County, but his crimes are breaking into trailers and things like that. And why he's evaded arrest this long, I say call Tommy Lee Jones and get the U.S. Marshals in, and they'll take care of that thing. But they haven't as of yet. And as of last count, the phone that he did steal has been pinging about 25 miles away. So that, while I can see how that might be a problem of people thinking, oh, is it safe to go out there? Well, let's say it this way. If you're going to come and visit us this week, let us know beforehand, or you might end up shot. Okay? If you have any questions, then by all means ask this evening for sure. Hopefully, if you did not ever think about it on these terms before, then just with our devotional reading a few minutes ago, it sounds a whole lot like Haman was his day's Hitler, doesn't it? I mean, maybe his name should have been Haman Hitler or Adolf Haman or something, you know, because of his hatred for the Jews. And actually, when you look at the foolishness of the king who could be so convinced to do something that would be so detrimental to this country of 135 provinces. Now, we're talking about a large swath of territory, folks. We're not talking about the size of Tennessee. We're talking about a whole lot more area, as we saw just recently in our study of Old Testament geography. We're talking about a large piece of ground for sure. And this would have constituted the totality of the Jewish population in the world. Now, you might have had somebody out visiting somewhere outside of this proximity, but more or less than all the Jews in the world were located in this close proximity of, with the capital city of Shushan and throughout the Medo-Persian Empire at this time. And here, somehow in some way, and lying about the situation, Haman has got the king to go along with exterminating these people. I mean, not letting any of them go. It almost sounds like the decree that God gave through Samuel to King Saul to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites, because that's what he's bound and determined to do to the Jews. Nobody is to be spared. And I don't go so far as say kill their animals, you know. And on top of it, you're given the added incentive that if you do kill them, then you can take their stuff. Now that sounds like Nazi Germany for sure, don't it? You know, if you wipe them off the face of the earth, then you can move into their house. You can have their paintings, you know, you can eat out of their gold bowls and all that goes along with that. So it wouldn't take very long at all to raise a pretty large army of volunteers who'd be willing to go and do something like that, because of the huge amount of spoil they're going to take. Now, it's into the midst of that situation, of course, that we have an opportunity to find a way to escape from the situation. Now, the thing was with the Medes and the Persians, and of course this is probably the case with a whole lot of governments, the Medes and the Persians refused to admit that they would ever make a law that was wrong. You know anybody like that? Have you ever heard of the principle that people oftentimes refer to in our country as a precedent that was set? No matter how goofy it was, how contrary to common sense it was, a precedent was set. What does that prove? Nothing. That somebody made a dumb decision at one time. 1973, a dumb decision was made relative to the absence of life and protection of an unborn child. You know, a precedent was set. And yet people still refer back to something that was decided long ago as if that's a standard. It ain't. Never has been. But the Medes and the Persians said if there's a law that's enacted, and there's one enacted here, it has the signet and regnant of the king, the authority to do it, the day is set, and all it has to do is be carried out, something's got to happen to get that fixed. And our lesson is going to be dealing with that in a providential way because of who happens to be on the throne. And of course it fits under the general title of our discussion of why we believe in the providence of God and just exactly what it is. And we're looking at the evidence in this particular book. So here we have again, the orders have been written. The king has provided the authority for the extermination of the Jews, which would include the new queen, Esther, because she's a Jew. But the king don't know that as of yet. Well, he's going to have to find out pretty quick, isn't he? The three things that we're looking at in regards to this is the interest of God in the plan, because this directly affects the fulfillment of promises going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, coming through the Abrahamic promises, and all concern the Messiah who's going to come to this world through this nation of people we call the Jews and go and provide the sacrifice for lost mankind. So this is a part of God's plan. Every bit of it is. And I'm convinced that's why we have this account in the Bible anyhow. Because if you look very intently at the book of Esther, you'll never see the word God in it. But yet you see God in almost every verse. And reckon why that is. Reckon that's providential. Well, I dare say it is. And we'll also look at the immutability of the plan. It can't be changed. And the infallibility of the plan as well. It will be carried out very quickly. Now, here's what Mordecai, who is in fact the person in charge of his cousin or niece, according to how you want to look at some of those words. And he tells Esther that this decree has been issued. And there is a possibility that the very reason why she has been elevated to this position as queen of the Medo-Persian Empire is for this very thing. And when he issues this decree or issues this proposal to the queen, as just a mere subject, you know, in the kingdom, he says, who knoweth? Or could it possibly be Esther? That all these things have just fallen out as they have, so that you can be the one that saved the people. Who knows? It just might be that the very reason why you are in the position you are. I mean, think about it. Here you're a Jewish girl, and you're the queen of the Medo-Persian Empire of all things. And how all that came about. Could it providentially be the case that that is what you are? From a human standpoint, there's the possibility. Who knows? Who knows? Now, obviously, we know who knows. It's God knows. God knows, and that's one of the great assurances that we have is that He does, you know. And we take confidence in the fact that God does know, and God does know how this all ends up. God does know the end result of all that's been going on since the very beginning. And He knows that righteousness ultimately wins out. And so our responsibility is to be righteous. And we're on the winning team. And that's pretty simple boiled down, but that's a fact of the case. We win, and the devil loses. Now, sometimes it don't look like it's happening, for sure. It didn't look that way even for the Jews who lived in the Medo-Persian Empire at this time. But God's righteous way will be successful. Nothing, and I mean nothing, absolutely nothing, in the scheme of redemption ever happened by accident. When you think about the workings of so many false doctrines, they try to tie God's power or God's intellectual abilities to allow for some of the most goofy things you could ever imagine. They try to leave the impression that God was not powerful enough to do what He intended to do when He sent Jesus to this earth, born of a virgin, born under the law. He couldn't accomplish. He had to come up with a substitute plan, and thus we live in the quote-unquote church age, which precedes the kingdom age, in which Jesus will come back to this earth and reign for 1,000 years on David's throne in the city of Jerusalem. That's only possible because God is not smart enough and not powerful enough to do what He intended to do when Jesus came the first time. Well, here's a little side point here. If God could be caught by surprise then, could He not be caught by surprise again? You see, if you leave an opening for the integrity of God being set aside, then just about anything is allowable, which of course amounts to blasphemy, which is exactly what premillennialism is blasphemy by its very nature. And this, of course, these passages we looked at this morning show that it was God's intention from the very beginning, from all eternity, to send His Son to this world to live and to die. Because God knew that while man would be given this wonderful place in which to live, that man would choose to sin and thus need a remedy for the problem of sin. And He knew that before He ever spoke this world into existence. How could He do that? It's because He's God. And He knows everything. He's omniscient. And He's also all-powerful, and He's also omnibenevolent. He's all-loving. He's all things to that. Nothing ever caught God by surprise. And none of these events that happened in here caught God by surprise. And the fellow who's working against God's plan here, who's doing the bidding of the devil, it's none other than Haman himself. Concerning this immutability of the plan that God has instituted from the very beginning, and first makes the promise in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, there's absolutely no way it can be changed. There cannot ever come a time throughout this whole unfolding of God's divine plan where He says, uh-oh, I'm going to have to back up and punt. That's not the way it is with God. Here in this situation, He's not going to have to back up and punt. He's going to use the resources and the things that transpire and man's free moral agency to accomplish just exactly what He wants to accomplish through this nation of people, the Jews. And He's going to use the instrumentality of Mordecai and Esther to get it done. Now, they have to exercise their free moral agency to be able to do it, but they do that, and God's will remains intact. Now, when it comes to this, now think about this. When it comes to the matter of providence as opposed to the miraculous, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, do people who come up with the ideas they do they even consult the Bible about any of it? Let's just think just one example when it comes to the miraculous. And think about in Acts chapter 3. Here's this lame man that lays at the gate every day, and Peter and John, they go into the gate, and here's a fellow there, he's been laying there every day. People hear him, they know him, he's there. Sometimes they assist him, sometimes they don't have the ability to assist him, and he's asking alms. And of course, what Peter and John let him know is that they don't have what he's desiring by way of physical money. But what they do have is what he would really like to have, and that's the ability to walk. And by the power of Jesus, He commands him to get up and walk. And he does. Now, there is a genuine miracle. What happens when a miracle is performed, as we're studying this quarter in our lessons? Well, it's something that was observable. You can see it. It was something that was direct, It was something that immediately took place. It was a complete healing. It wasn't a partial healing, He didn't say, okay, go home and rub your legs with apple cider vinegar for 3 months, and you'll be able to tiptoe around a little bit, and maybe in about a year, miraculously, that's not a miracle. It was complete. It was such an incredible thing that people saw what happened, and guess what? That gave them an opportunity then for an audience to preach to them, which was the design of it. And what took place is absolutely impossible from a physical standpoint. That's why a miracle is supernatural. and not simply natural. Now, what about providence? As in the case here with the book of Esther, we don't see it. It's something that takes place outside of our view. It is something that takes place in an indirect way. It's something that takes place over time. It's not immediate. It's not a complete thing. It is at different points of time thing that takes place. It is a credible explanation. I mean, did the things that happen here in the book of Esther, could they happen? Well, certainly they could happen. They did happen. That's somewhat strange how the things fall right into place, but it's something that could happen. It's something that had the possibility of happening, and that's providential, as clearly opposed to the miraculous here in this case. Now, when you see this being carried out, there's a number of points I think that we could derive from it. First, God's protection to make sure the infallibility of this plan takes place. Notice here's what Mordecai says, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place." Now what is he saying? He says, now if you don't do what you do have the ability to do, something's going to happen here. What Haman has devised, exterminate the Jews, and what the king has gone along with to exterminate the Jews, and actually people are going to get paid by what they steal from the people they kill. If you don't do something, Esther, somebody will. Somebody's got to. Now why does he think that? Well, he knows that the Jews simply cannot be exterminated. Just like in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham knew that if he killed his son Isaac, then Isaac has got to be raised from the dead. Now that's trusting God to be telling the truth, isn't it? Exactly. And that's what happens here. Somebody is going to see to it that the Jews are not exterminated, and that's what Mordecai affirms. These 4 words we see in the lesson will be yours. First, caution. The caution, I would submit here, comes from the evil intentions of Haman. When he, as we read this morning, some of the things he said about the Jews were accurate, but some of the things he said about the Jews was not accurate. They were lies. And of course it was the lies that caught the attention and the ear of the king, who said, oh no, if we've got people amongst us scattered all throughout the nation, they're diverse from all people, and they don't keep the king's laws, we'd be better off not to have them part of our kingdom. That's true. The only problem is they did keep the king's laws. As long as they were not in violation of God's law, they were good citizens. Same thing today. Now, think about this. If every faithful child of God was removed from the United States of America, would the United States of America be a better nation or a worse nation? Well, that's not even debatable. You can't have better citizens than faithful children of God. Ahasuerus couldn't have better citizens than faithful children of God living under the Jewish system. They were a benefit to his country, not a detriment. It was a lie. And since it was a lie, and sometimes this is just very difficult for people to admit, people who are enemies of what's right and true, and those who are trying to do what's right and true, lie oftentimes about those who are doing the right thing. Have you ever been lied about? In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, it's the last of the Beatitudes, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely. What is that? That's lying. We are to live in such a way that people have to make up stuff. They have to lie about us to try to get an edge with their error. Now, sadly, most of the time we give them plenty of ammunition where they don't have to make up stuff. But it should be the case that they do have to lie about us. You can't trust the enemies of God's people. Now, notice what's going to happen here on the case with Esther here. Esther chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know. and since they know, then when we read this, we'll know too, that whosoever, whether he's a man or whether he's a woman, shall come into the king into the inner court who is not called, and there's a law that says that person could die. Just like that. Just like that. And a few years ago when we studied this, I remember the kids understood this principle exactly because they had this golden scepter. And if the king stretches out the golden scepter to the person who's entered, then that allows them to come in and make a petition for the king, and they won't die. So here's a law that says you can't go into the king unannounced. And what is Mordecai trying to get Esther to do? Go into the king unannounced? That's dangerous. That's dangerous. Now, if she's burnt the biscuits that morning, it could be even more dangerous. Yeah. So you got to be careful when you go in to the king. But here's what Esther decides. She told Mordecai, all right, me and my girls, we're going to be fasting and praying. I want y'all to get all the Jews in Shushan, which is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. I want you to get all them together, and y'all don't eat, and y'all don't drink anything, fast and pray for 3 days. And then, even though it's not according to the law, even though it's a violation of the restrictions placed upon anybody going before the king, I will go in unto the king, and if I perish, I perish. Wow. I say probably right here that Mordecai has convinced Esther that maybe, just maybe, she is in this position for such a time as this. If I perish, I perish. She knew what the right thing was to do. She had to intervene in behalf of her people. Now, even though Mordecai has said it, and even though maybe she could figure it out too, if she don't do something, somebody's going to do something. She says, I'm going to do what I know I ought to do. I'm in the position where I can do it. But if I die doing this, I'll die doing this. Because it's the right thing to do. Now, there's other ways that you can say the same thing. You can say, okay, I'm going to preach it. Now, if I'm fired, I'm fired. You know? Or I'm going to knock on this door. And they may tell me to get lost, but I'm going to knock on the door anyhow. And if they tell me to get lost, I'll get lost. You know, I won't come on. I'll knock the dust off my sandals, you know, and make a mark here and know that here's a place that probably I'm going to wait a little while before I come back and visit it. Sometimes we have to do the right thing, even though the consequences of doing the right thing may not be what we'd like to be. But we've got to do it in behalf of the truth and behalf of God. As we oftentimes say, you know, while silence is oftentimes golden, at other times it's just plain old yellow. And there's been too many cowards masquerading as gospel preachers and faithful children of God in this generation. Amen. No doubt about it. So here she goes. It came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so that when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter and told him what the deal was. Here's why I'm here, king. This fella, Haman, he's trying to exterminate all the Jews. I'm a Jew. I'm going to be exterminated too. Uh-oh. Well, what was the decree? We mentioned a few minutes ago that according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, they could not admit, uh-oh, we've made a mistake, we're going to have to mark that law off. Couldn't do that. What they had to do, in order to comply with their goofy ideas, they had to come up with another law that would in fact circumvent that first law. And the other law was, the Jews are given the right by the Medo-Persian government to defend themselves. Yeah. Have you ever wished that during World War II there had been a whole lot more Jews trying to defend themselves? Now some of them did. But too many of them, in my estimation, politely got on boxcars and went to their death. I just couldn't do that. They'd shoot me in the head as I'm running right straight on, head on with a German Shepherd. Because I ain't getting on a little boxcar knowing I'm going to my death. Don't do that. Well, here we see a clear example of self-defense. So here's what the king said. He granted the Jews that were in every city to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy and to slay and to cause to perish all the power of the people in the province that would assault them, both the little ones and women, to take the spoil of them for prey. So they're given the right to defend themselves. Well, what was the result of that? We continue reading in verses 16 and 17 of this same Esther chapter 8. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And notice this. And many of the people of the land were proselyted. You mean here's an evangelistic effort? Yeah. Now, of course, the last phrase there says, for fear of the Jews that fell upon them. Was that a contributing factor to them maybe examining what they believed all this time? How is it that all of a sudden things have turned out so good for these people amongst us? Now, they knew, if these were faithful Jews, they knew they were different. And they knew that their difference was a difference for good. And then they see that things work out to where they're able to defend themselves with authorization from the king himself. I believe I want to be a part of these people. What do I have to do to become a Jew? It does something. It does something. Now, be careful lest you draw too many conclusions from that, as to what we're going to be doing and killing people, and hopefully people will see our righteous indignation in the extermination of that which is evil, and thus use that as an evangelistic tool. That's not what we're saying. For such a time as this. That little phrase there explains the totality of what providence is, and the example of Esther in this particular narrative. Let me ask the question. Are you a truth seeker? Am I a seeker of the truth? Or like we mentioned this morning, are we people that just believe whatever's said in the pulpit because, after all, they've studied and they probably know what they're talking about, so I'll just sort of swallow it without examination? Well, that's not what truth seekers do. No. You don't accept something just because the fellow that's saying what he's saying gives you bread. Anybody can do that. You accept it because upon examination of what's said, you realize it's the truth. And then you accept the truth based upon that. Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, that should describe every one of us. And that honestly describes a truth seeker. Truth seekers ask, and it's given them. They seek, and they find, because they do seek. They knock, and it's open to them. Are we asking, seeking, and knocking? Truth seekers do that very thing. We have an example of some truth seekers who are described as noble. Not because of a lineage of kings in their blood, but because of their honesty and examination of what they hear. They were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the Word of God with all readiness of mind, and they searched the Scriptures daily to see if those things were so. And upon their searching the Scriptures, they found out they were so. Paul was telling them the truth. And they resulted in becoming New Testament Christians too. Are you a true seeker? See, here's the thing. Every time we're assembled is an opportunity for people to take advantage of their truth-seeking attitude and become new. It's possible that in an audience of this size, the very reason why you're here this evening is because you are a truth seeker. And now that you've seen the truth relative to this matter, then you're willing not only to accept it, but to everything else that the Lord says relative to becoming a Christian, being a member of the Lord's church, and making preparation for an eternity above. Are you a truth seeker. Now, here's the cases of conversion in the book of Acts. Every one of them resulted in people getting wet. You cannot become a Christian without being baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins. And there, water means water, regardless of what some will do to try to avoid the thrust of it. And it all is a part of God's simple plan. Simple because everybody in the whole wide world is to hear it. And God would not send a message impossible to be heard to all the world who would be so confused they couldn't figure it out. Every accountable human being hearing the right thing can believe it. They can repent of their sins. They can confess the name of Christ. And they then can be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of their sins, at which time the Lord will add them to His church. Have you done that? Are you living faithful? Or have you possibly gone back into sin as an erring child of God? Whatever your need this evening, if you need to respond to heaven's invitation, let us know how we can assist you while together we stand and while we sing.